In the autumn of 52 before Christ, the greatest military commander in history gave an order that defied all known logic. Julius Caesar commanded 50,000 Roman soldiers to build their own tomb. They would voluntarily trap themselves between 80,000 enemies inside a fortress and 250,000 more marching from outside. Think about that for a moment. 50,000 Romans caught between 330,000 Gauls. No escape route, no possibility of retreat. Only walls they themselves raised with their own hands, sealing themselves between two colossal armies that desired only one thing: to see every Roman legionary dead. And then the storm broke loose. From the hills, a human tide descended upon the outer fortifications. Arrows darkened the sky like clouds of iron. Screams tore through the air in two directions, the ditches filled with corpses. Hidden stakes pierced feet and thighs. The Romans fought back to back, surrounded by the entire world. Inside Alésia, 80,000 warriors hurled themselves against the inner walls. Outside, 250,000 charged against the outer defenses. 50,000 men trapped between two storms of steel. And when the sun finally rose over that valley, the fate of Western civilization had been decided. On the plains of Gaul, between bloody ditches and smoldering ramparts, one empire had been born and another had died forever. Gaul in the year 52 before Christ was a powder keg waiting to explode. For 6 long years, Julius Caesar had conquered tribe after tribe, claiming victory after victory. But conquest is not the same as control, and the Gallic tribes were reaching their breaking point. The Romans had arrived as traders and allies. They remained as masters. Each summer brought new legions across the Rhine River. Each winter left behind burned villages and decapitated chieftains. The Druids, guardians of sacred traditions, watched their holy groves being profaned. The nobles saw their lands divided among foreigners. The warriors saw their sons taken as hostages to Rome. The oppression had become unbearable. It was then that a name emerged that would echo through history: Vercingetorix. The young prince of the Arverni was not just another tribal chief. He was a visionary who understood a truth no other Gaul had perceived. Divided, they would be destroyed one by one. United, they could achieve the impossible. Vercingetorix spent months riding from village to village, from tribal council to tribal council. He spoke of freedom, he spoke of honor, he spoke of their ancestors' bones being trampled by Roman sandals. Hereditary enemies who had shed each other's blood for generations suddenly found themselves sitting around the same fires. More than 40 tribes that had never agreed on anything agreed on a single thing: hatred of Rome. At Bibracte, the assembly of tribes elected Vercingetorix as supreme commander of the Gallic forces. It was the first time in history that Gaul spoke with a single voice, and that voice cried out for Roman blood. Vercingetorix's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. He ordered the scorched earth policy: burn your own villages, poison your own wells, destroy your own crops. If the Romans find no food, they will starve before they die by the sword. It was a terrible sacrifice, but the Gauls understood. They were fighting for their very existence. Caesar faced a situation more precarious than most people realize. 6 years of conquest meant nothing if he could not maintain control. In Rome, his political enemies circled like vultures. The moment he showed weakness, the moment he failed, they would strip him of his command. Without his legions, without his victories, Caesar would face exile or death. This was not just about glory, it was about survival. He commanded 10 legions, approximately 50,000 of Rome's finest soldiers. They were not recruits or militiamen. They were professionals who had been fighting in Gaul for years. The gladius, the shield, the pilum, weapons that had conquered the known world. Riding alongside them were 10,000 Germanic cavalry. They were not Romans. They were mercenaries from beyond the Rhine. savage warriors who collected scalps and fought nearly naked. Years before, Rome had faced them as enemies. Now they rode alongside the legions. That kind of pragmatism made Caesar dangerous. His inner circle read like a roster of great names in Roman history. Labienus, his second in command, a tactical genius in his own right. Mark Antony, young and hungry for glory, commanding his first independent force. And strangest of all, Marcus Brutus, fighting loyally beside the man he would one day assassinate. Imagine that irony. Caesar teaching his future killer how to win impossible battles. When Caesar's scouts first sighted Alesia, any reasonable commander would have sought another target. The fortress rested upon a plateau surrounded by rivers and valleys. Natural defenses made it virtually impregnable. The high ground gave the defenders every advantage. Attacking it was pure madness. But Caesar saw something others did not see. Vercingetorix had made Alésia his stronghold, gathering 80,000 of his finest warriors behind its walls. The Gallic leader thought himself safe. Thought Caesar would never dare attack such a position. That arrogance would prove fatal, for geography cuts both ways. The same features that made Alésia impregnable also transformed it into a trap. Once inside, Vercingetorix's army would need supplies. 80,000 warriors consumed provisions at a staggering rate. Each day of siege meant hundreds of animals slaughtered, tons of grain consumed, thousands of gallons of water needed. The fortress that protected them could also become their prison. Then Caesar gave an order that made his own generals think he had gone mad. Instead of assaulting Alesia, instead of starving them out from a safe distance, he ordered something unprecedented. His legions would build walls, not just any walls, a complete encirclement of the entire plateau. 18 kilometers of fortifications trapping Vercingetorix inside. But this was only half the madness. Before the circumvallation was complete, Vercingetorix sent all his cavalry out under cover of night. The riders galloped through the valleys, carrying a single message to every tribe in Gaul. Come, bring every man who can carry a spear. The greatest gathering of warriors in Gallic history was summoned. Every tribe that could send fighters received orders to march to Alesia. The Confederation demanded 250,000 men. Incredibly, the tribes answered. Caesar received the intelligence that changed everything. Scouts reported massive movement throughout Gaul. The relief army was not just coming. It would be larger than anyone imagined. Conservative estimates placed it at 250,000. Some reports claimed 300,000. Caesar faced a terrible choice: abandon the siege or do something insane. He chose insanity. Caesar ordered the construction of a second line of fortifications, the contravallation facing outward. His army would build another wall, 21 kilometers in length, transforming their position into a fortress within a fortress. They would voluntarily trap themselves between Alesia and the relief army. 50,000 Romans caught between 330,000 Gauls. It was the most audacious suicide trap in military history. The engineering details of these fortifications bordered on the obsessive. Beyond the ditches and ramparts, Caesar ordered obstacles that would make any charge impossible. The Sippi were logs with sharpened branches projecting outward at eye level. Charging cavalry or running infantry would impale themselves on them. But Caesar had one more engineering trick that would transform defense into slaughter. The lilia were pits 1 meter deep with sharpened stakes at the bottom, covered with brush. Thousands of these death traps dotted the approaches, invisible until too late. In front of everything, they scattered the stimuli, 30-centimeter iron spikes driven into the ground at angles. Like ancient landmines, invisible until the moment a bare foot found them. For weeks, the Romans worked like demons. Sleep became a luxury. Exhausted legionaries collapsed at their posts, were revived, and continued digging. The Germanic cavalry fought constant skirmishes, buying time. These wild horsemen became Caesar's eyes and ears, patrolling kilometers beyond the fortifications. They brought back disturbing news. The relief army included contingents from every major Gallic tribe. This was not just an army, it was a nation in arms. Food shortages began affecting both sides. Inside Alésia, Vercingetorix put his men on reduced rations. Outside, Caesar's supplies dwindled daily. The mathematics were brutal. 50,000 Romans plus 10,000 cavalry meant 60,000 mouths to feed. Even with Germanic foraging, starvation loomed on the horizon. Then something happened that no one expected. Caesar's own men began to doubt. Centurions reported murmurs in the ranks. The soldiers understood courage, understood fighting against odds, but voluntarily trapping themselves, building their own prison. Some wondered if their commander had finally gone too far. Caesar responded with typical brilliance. He toured the fortifications personally, speaking to work crews, praising their efforts, explaining his vision. "We are not trapping ourselves," he told them. "We are creating a killing ground where Roman discipline will slaughter Gallic courage." The murmurs ceased. Every Roman understood, if the line broke, they would all die. There was nowhere to flee. No surrender was possible. It was victory or death. Inside Alésia, the situation deteriorated each day. The supplies that should have lasted 30 days were running out faster than anticipated. 80,000 hungry mouths consumed everything. The horses were the first to die, slaughtered for their meat. Then came the pack animals. Finally, rats became delicacies. The Mandubi, the local tribe that inhabited Alésia, made a desperate plea to Vercingetorix. "Expel the women, the children, the old, the sick. They cannot fight. They only consume food. Perhaps the Romans will accept them as slaves and feed them." Vercingetorix agreed. The gates opened, and thousands of civilians descended the hill toward the Roman lines. Old men leaning on staffs, mothers carrying babies, children crying from hunger. They begged to be accepted. They offered themselves as slaves in exchange for bread. Caesar watched them from atop a tower. His face betrayed no emotion. Then he gave his order. "They will not be admitted. They will receive no food. They will not be accepted as prisoners." The order was carried out. The civilians remained in no man's land between the walls, trapped between their own relatives inside Alésia and the Romans who refused to feed them. There they stayed day after day, slowly dying of starvation in full view of both armies. It was calculated cruelty. Caesar wanted the Gauls inside Alésia to hear the screams of their own families. He wanted desperation to corrode their determination. He wanted them to know exactly what would happen if they did not surrender. It was psychological warfare in its most brutal form. Then, one September morning, the horizon darkened. They were not clouds. It was movement. Lines of cavalry cresting the hilltops, their armor gleaming like scales in the pale light. Behind them came the endless columns of infantry, standards fluttering in the wind, war drums echoing through the valleys. The relief army had arrived. From the walls of Alésia, the besieged warriors saw their liberators approaching. A roar of hope exploded from the plateau. Inside the Roman fortifications, 50,000 men looked toward the hills and saw death advancing toward them. 250,000 Gauls encamped on the plains beyond the contravallation. It was the largest military force Gaul had ever assembled. Warriors from every tribe, from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine, from the Mediterranean to the English Channel. Different languages, different gods, different ways of fighting, all united by one thing: to free Vercingetorix and crush Rome. The dawn of the first day revealed the full magnitude of Caesar's gamble. The relief army spread across the horizon like a dark ocean. Gallic banners fluttered in every direction. The Romans were now outnumbered 7-1, trapped between hammer and anvil. Commius of the Atrebates led the first assault on the outer walls. 40,000 warriors charged against the western section, shouting war chants that echoed through the hills. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix coordinated his own attack, sending his men against the inner fortifications. For the first time in history, an army fought a siege in two directions simultaneously. The Roman response demonstrated why they had conquered the world. Pre-positioned sentries wheeled into position with mechanical precision. The fighting in the towers began immediately. Gauls with ladders and grappling hooks trying to scale the walls, while Romans stabbed downward with pila. But the prepared defenses proved their worth. Charging Gauls hit the concealed Lilia pits, men screaming as sharpened stakes pierced their feet, their calves, their thighs. The stimuli claimed hundreds more, iron spikes tearing through sandals and flesh. The Scipi, those sharpened logs, channeled the attacking forces into kill zones. The Gauls could not charge in a straight line. They had to weave between the obstacles. This gave the Roman artillery, scorpions and ballistae, clear targets. Imagine trying to dodge giant arrows while navigating a maze of death traps. The sensory overload was total. Screams came from both directions. Vercingetorix's warriors hammering the inner walls. The relief army assaulting the outer fortifications. Arrows fell like deadly rain, so dense that soldiers said the sky darkened. The clash of iron against wood, gladius against shield, created a constant thunder that deafened men for days. By midday, the northwest section was in crisis. Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's cousin and Arvernian commander, had identified a weak point where the fortifications crossed difficult terrain. He led 60,000 picked warriors against this single section. The Romans there, 2 legions, approximately 10,000 men, faced 6-to-1 odds. Caesar watched from his command position, purple cloak visible to all. He had to make an impossible choice. Reinforce the northwest and risk other sections breaking, or trust his men to hold against overwhelming numbers. This is the moment when Caesar earned his legend. He sent only 6,000 reinforcements, just enough to stabilize, not enough to weaken other sectors. The fighting reached inhuman intensity. Romans fought in shifts, fresh centuries rotating in as exhausted men stumbled back. But there were only so many fresh troops. By late afternoon, some centuries had rotated 3 times. Men fought despite wounds that would normally take them out of combat. There was nowhere to retreat to. The statistical impact was staggering. The Romans were firing 100,000 arrows per hour at peak battle. Every archer had pre-positioned bundles. Slingers added their lead bullets to the storm. The killing ground between the obstacles and the walls became carpeted with bodies. Wounded Gauls could not retreat through the press of men behind them. They died where they fell. Night brought no relief. The Gauls lit torches, continuing their assaults in the darkness. Romans fought by touch and sound, stabbing at shapes looming out of the blackness. The confusion was total. Friend and foe mingled in the darkness. Men killed their own comrades by mistake. Officers lost control of their units. Only the walls maintained any sense of order. The dawn of the second day revealed the carnage. Bodies piled 3 meters high in some sections. The wounded and dying carpeted the ground between the walls. But the relief army was far from broken. Fresh contingents moved forward, stepping over their dead comrades. Inside Alésia, Vercingetorix prepared his decisive assault. Caesar received reports that Labienus's section was about to break. 6 cohorts had been fighting for 20 straight hours. The general himself was wounded, still fighting in the front rank. Without immediate reinforcement, the entire northern section would collapse. Simultaneously, Mark Antony's position came under massive assault. The future triumvir faced 40,000 Gauls with just 6,000 exhausted Romans. Messages begged for reinforcement. Cannot hold much longer. Caesar faced every commander's nightmare. 2 crisis points, insufficient reserves to address both. But then something occurred that no one, not even Caesar, expected. The Germanic cavalry, held in reserve between the walls, took matters into their own hands. Their chieftain, whose name history sadly does not record, saw the crisis and acted. Without orders, 4,000 horsemen charged out a rear gate, riding hard around the entire battle to hit the Gauls attacking Labienus from behind. Caesar made his choice. Taking his last reserve, just 13 cohorts, about 6,000 men, he split them. Half went to Antony, half followed him personally to Labienus. But here is the detail that changes everything. Caesar did not just send reinforcements, he led them personally, purple cloaks streaming, clearly visible to every Roman on the walls. The psychological impact was instant. Exhausted legionaries, who could barely lift their shields, suddenly found new strength. "Caesar comes!" The cry spread along the walls faster than any messenger. Men who had been fighting for a day and a night prepared for one more effort. What happened in the next 60 seconds decided Western civilization. 3 forces converged on the northwest section simultaneously. Labienus's exhausted men held the wall. Caesar's reinforcements hit from inside. The Germanic cavalry smashed into the Gallic rear. Caught between 3 forces pressed against their own obstacles, the Gauls had nowhere to go. The slaughter was absolute. Unable to retreat through the press of their own men, unable to advance through Roman steel, the Gauls died where they stood. The Germanic cavalry, in their element now, cut down fleeing warriors with savage efficiency. They were not Roman citizens bound by rules. They were paid to kill, and they earned their gold that day. Inside Alésia, Vercingetorix watched his cousin's force disintegrate. He had launched his own assault, sending every available warrior against the inner walls. For a brief moment, it seemed like the interior might break even as the exterior held. Gallic warriors actually breached the inner wall in 3 places. This is when things went from desperate to impossible. Caesar, still visible in his purple cloak, led a charge that military historians still study. Leaving subordinates to handle the outer battle, he raced to the inner wall. The sight of their commander, personally leading reinforcements, turned the tide. Romans, who had been falling back, suddenly stood firm. But the Gauls had one advantage Caesar could not counter: desperation. They knew this was their last chance. Warriors threw themselves on Roman spears to create gaps for their comrades. Noble cavalry dismounted, preferring to die on foot rather than flee. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence that survivors could barely describe. Then came the moment that would haunt survivors forever. The relief army's main force, seeing the northwest attack fail, seeing thousands of their best warriors trapped and dying, broke. Not a gradual retreat, not a fighting withdrawal. They simply turned and ran, 200,000 men fleeing the field, abandoning their trapped comrades inside Alésia. From the walls, Vercingetorix saw it happen. The relief army he had summoned, the force that was supposed to save Gaul, running. His assault on the inner walls faltered as word spread. Warriors who had been ready to die suddenly lost heart. The greatest army Gaul had ever assembled was melting away like morning mist. Caesar seized the moment. Fresh Germanic cavalry pursued the fleeing Gauls for miles, cutting down stragglers. Roman infantry burst from the fortifications, adding to the slaughter. What started as a battle became a rout, then a massacre. The killing continued until exhaustion, not mercy, stopped it. As the sun set on the second day, 50,000 Romans had done the impossible. But what happened next would echo through history. The dawn of the third day brought an eerie silence. No war cries, no assault preparations. From Alésia's highest tower, a white flag appeared. After witnessing the relief army's abandonment, after losing thousands of his best warriors, Vercingetorix had called his final council. The Gallic chieftains faced a bitter choice: continue fighting and face starvation, or surrender and hope for terms. Some advocated fighting to the death. Others, more pragmatic, pointed out that their families were also trapped in Alésia. The debate raged through the night, but Vercingetorix himself ended it with characteristic nobility. "I united Gaul to fight for freedom," he reportedly said. "I will not let it die for my pride." He would surrender personally, taking full responsibility, hoping Caesar might spare the others. It was the decision of a true leader, sacrificing himself for his people. The statistics tell their own brutal story. In just 2 days of fighting, 40,000 Gauls lay dead between the walls. Thousands more died in the pursuit. Roman casualties, while serious, were remarkably light for such a battle. The Lilia pits alone had killed more enemies than many entire battles. The surrender ceremony became legendary. Vercingetorix donned his finest armor, his best weapons, mounted his most decorated horse. He rode out from Alesia's gates alone, approaching Caesar's command position. In full view of both armies, he circled Caesar's chair once. A final moment of Gallic pride. Then he dismounted and laid his arms at the Romans' feet. Caesar, ever the showman, remained seated throughout. The symbolism was deliberate and crushing, the greatest Gallic warrior submitting to a seated Roman. The man who had united 40 tribes kneeling before the representative of Roman order. In that moment, independent Gaul died forever. The practical aftermath began immediately. 80,000 warriors filed out of Alésia, laying down their weapons in massive piles. Roman quartermasters catalogued everything: swords, spears, shields, armor. The logistics of disarming so many took 3 full days. Each tribe's warriors were separated, counted, processed like livestock. Caesar's treatment of prisoners depended entirely on politics. Aedui and Arverni warriors from tribes Rome needed as allies were released to return home, but 40,000 others were not so fortunate. They were distributed among Caesar's legions as slaves, payment for years of hard campaigning, and Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader, received special treatment. Caesar could not simply execute such a valuable prisoner. The Gallic chief would be kept alive, imprisoned but well treated, saved for Caesar's eventual triumph in Rome. For 6 years, Vercingetorix would remain in Roman custody, a living trophy of Caesar's greatest victory. Then, during the triumph in Rome, he was paraded through the streets, then ritually strangled in the Tullianum prison. His death marked the final act of Alesia's tragedy. A brave leader who had united his people only to see them crushed by Roman efficiency. The immediate consequence of Alésia was Gaul's complete submission. Within months, the last pockets of resistance crumbled. Tribes that had fought Romans for generations suddenly accepted Roman law, Roman taxes, Roman civilization. The transformation happened with stunning speed. Within a generation, Gallic nobles were sending their sons to study in Rome. The Gallic Wars cost an estimated 1 million lives, with another million enslaved. Entire tribes essentially ceased to exist. Alésia marked the end point of that cultural genocide, the moment organized Gallic resistance died. But Alésia's impact extended far beyond Gaul. Caesar's double wall technique revolutionized siege warfare forever. Military engineers studied his fortifications for centuries. Napoleon himself visited Alésia's site, trying to understand Caesar's genius. Even today, armies analyze the battle as the perfect example of turning defensive warfare into offensive victory. Politically, Alésia cleared Caesar's path to civil war. His enemies in Rome could not touch him now. Who arrests a general who conquered Gaul? The wealth from Gallic slaves and plunder made Caesar richer than some kingdoms. The loyalty of his veterans, forged in moments like Alésia, would follow him across the Rubicon. The engineering legacy established Roman fortification doctrine for centuries. Every Roman siege afterward reflected Alésia's lessons. Double walls, Lilia pits, obstacles creating kill zones, all became standard practice. Roman military manuals preserved Caesar's exact specifications, turning his desperate innovation into systematic doctrine. Culturally, Alésia accelerated the Romanization of Western Europe. Latin spread through Gaul within decades. Roman roads followed Roman victories. Gallic gods acquired Roman names. The civilization that emerged, Gallo-Roman culture, would shape France, parts of Germany, Switzerland, and Belgium forever. Here is the philosophical heart of Alesia. When is risking everything the only rational choice? Caesar faced political destruction if he failed in Gaul, so he chose the insane option: trap himself between two armies because normal strategies would not achieve total victory. Sometimes the craziest plan is the only sane one. Modern military thinking still reflects Alésia. When facing superior numbers, create advantages through preparation and terrain. Force enemies to fight on your terms. Transform defensive positions into offensive weapons. Make the enemy's strength irrelevant through superior positioning. Every special forces unit studying defensive warfare learns Alesia's lessons. But Caesar's gamble vindicated more than military theory. Fortune favors the bold became more than a saying. Alésia proved it true. By choosing the impossible, by refusing to accept limitations, Caesar demonstrated that audacity could overcome arithmetic. 50,000 disciplined men could defeat 330,000 brave ones. The historical pivot cannot be overstated. Without Alésia, no secure Roman Gaul. Without Roman Gaul, no buffer against Germanic tribes. Without that buffer, Rome falls centuries earlier. Without Roman stability, no preservation of classical knowledge through the Dark Ages. Western civilization's trajectory was fundamentally altered on those September days in 52 before Christ. Caesar buried 50,000 men alive and, in doing so, gave birth to an empire that would last 1,000 years. Sometimes the most insane strategies create the most lasting victories. Alésia reminds us that when faced with impossible odds, the answer is not to retreat. It is to make the impossible possible through preparation, discipline, and sheer audacity. And when the centuries pass and empires turn to dust, the echo of those days still resounds. In the silent hills of Burgundy, where once blood stained the earth red, the wind still whispers the names of those who fought there, of the Gauls who died for their freedom, of the Romans who risked everything for glory, and of two men, Caesar and Vercingetorix, whose confrontation decided which civilization would inherit the world.